When ready to remove the chocks, as ground crew, walk along the leading edge of the wing to keep you out of the propeller arc and gently ease the chocks away. Do not yank them, as if they jam there is a danger of them flicking up into the propeller arc. And then reverse back down the leading edge of the wing. That will keep you safe. From the pilot's perspective, ease the throttle friction nut just so that you can easily operate the throttle, and ensure that the elevator trimmer is in the fully back tail heavy position. Both the elevators and ailerons are positioned to counteract the effects of the wind, even in light conditions. Have a good look all around the aircraft and then smoothly open the throttle and taxi forward. Taxiing should be in a weave to make sure the area you are going towards is clear. The braking effect of the skid on grass is very good, but very poor on tarmac. You might get yourself stuck if the tickover is too fast and have to switch the engine off. Prolonged taxiing on tarmac wears the skid out, so should be avoided if possible. Steering can be particularly difficult on tarmac, so you might want to enlist the help of some wing walkers. Providing that speed is kept very low though, and in not much wind, the aircraft is controllable on tarmac, as Paul is showing you here. He's showing you the way that the rudder steers the steerable skid. However, the aircraft is much more controllable on grass. So here's going to show you a few more taxiing exercises. Generally, when the aircraft is into wind, the stick should be held back. But if when wanting to turn, the ease is put just forward of the neutral position, it removes the weight from the tail and helps the aircraft to turn in a tighter radius. While taxiing downwind, the stick should be held just forward of the central position to prevent the wind getting under the tail, particularly in gusty conditions, and tipping the aircraft on its nose. So, forward for downwind, but back for into wind as the stick position. While taxiing across the wind, if you've got an into wind component, the stick should be into wind. If the aeroplane is taxiing downwind, then generally the stick is held away from the wind. Always keep the speed at a maximum of a brisk walking pace and in control. If you lose control of the aircraft, remember switching the engine off is always a good option. So to reiterate, to get the tightest turn on the ground, allow the aircraft to stop, put full rudder in the direction you want to turn, preferably through the into wind position, ease the stick fully forward against the forward stop, and then use a burst of power to swing the aircraft round. Once the turn is complete, bring the throttle back to idle to prevent excessive speed build-up and bring the stick back to the neutral position. With the pilot's forward view being obscured by the engine, it's vitally important that the taxi is in a weave when the area ahead is cleared. Ground handling the Tiger Moth is significantly different to that of a modern tricycle undercarriaged aircraft, but with practice you'll improve and find it most rewarding. Time for takeoff checks. Trim is set for takeoff, throttle friction nut is tight. No mixture, but if it is, it should be rich. Magnetos, both up and on. Fuel is fully selected on and gated, and don't forget to check the contents in the upper tank sight. The slat should be unlocked and free, gyros and gauges set, oil pressure checked, hatches, doors closed on both cockpits, and remember the back locker door, make sure your harness is secure, and the controls should be checked for full, free and correct movement. Of course the rudder is checked while taxiing. And now we need to do our emergencies brief. If the engine stops on takeoff, where are you going to land? Straight ahead almost certainly to start with, and as we get higher, which way is the wind coming from, and which way is it going to be safest to turn into wind to avoid obstructions during the climb out? Once we're sure that we know what we're going to do if it does stop, a good look up the approach and then a good look up the runway, and it's time for us to line up. There is no published crosswind limit for the Tiger, but 10 knots is a reasonable limit. After that, you run out of aileron control, so the aileron should be held fully into the wind to prevent the wing from rising. The throttle is smoothly opened at a rate commensurate where you can keep the aircraft straight with the rudder, and as the aircraft reaches about 10 to 15 miles an hour, the stick moves centrally forward to lift the tail into the takeoff attitude. Do not be tempted to lift the tail too quickly, particularly in a crosswind, as when the skid is on the ground, it makes the aircraft more stable in yaw. You'll find that the stick reaches a neutral position as the aircraft gets to the takeoff attitude, and it's this takeoff attitude that's all important. So let's have a look at that takeoff again. We smoothly open the throttle, keep the aeroplane straight with the rudder, wings level with the aileron. Lift the tail. Now here's this from the cockpit, and you can see the horizon cutting the centre section struts with the tail down, and now the tail has come up to that takeoff attitude. We hold the attitude and the aircraft will lift off the ground when it's ready to fly. We can then let the speed accelerate to the climb speed of 65 miles per hour. Once safely away from the ground, we can check in that our airspeed is correct, this ASI is in knots, and that our oil pressure is good. Speeds in excess of 65 miles an hour will cause a seriously degraded rate of climb, but similarly speeds below this figure can also cause a degraded rate of climb and may lead towards engine overheating. The Gypsy Major Handbook says you can climb at full power for 5 minutes, but for many operators, once safely clear of obstructions, by reducing the throttle just till the RPM starts to decrease, will actually reduce the cylinder head temperature and increase engine life. As with all flying, a good lockout is really important, and no more different in the Tiger Moth to any other aircraft. So a good weaving turn to check under the nose in the climb, and also remember to look behind the wings as you turn. When you want to turn, a good look in the direction and then smoothly apply coordinated aileron and rudder in the direction required. This initially takes a little bit of getting used to as the rudder is particularly powerful, but after a bit of practice you'll soon get the hang of it. As we turn, the slip needle on the turn and slip should be kept in the centre, as seen here. The Tiger Moth is a bit of a cross really between a glider and a modern powered aircraft, but once you get the hang of it you'll find it particularly rewarding. Similarly, in straight and level flight, the slip needle should be centred. So before we look at some landings, let's recap our takeoffs.
Golf Indy Zulu is ready for departure. Golf Indy Zulu 23 glass, clear for takeoff, service wind 3-5 degrees. Clear takeoff, 23 glass, Golf Indy Zulu.
We have a good look up the approach to make sure it's all clear, and a good look down the runway to make sure that's also clear, and then line the aircraft up. Once lined up, the aircraft should be taxied forward a short distance with the rudder bar central in order to straighten the tail skid. Once ready to go, smoothly apply full power at a rate commensurate with keeping it straight with the rudder. If a crosswind is present, it is advisable to start with pronounced or even full into-wind aileron. The aim is to hold the wing down before it starts to rise. It's a lot easier than catching it after it has risen. A crosswind from the right will tend to accentuate the aeroplane's natural swing and cause for great dexterity on the rudder to keep it straight. But a wind from the left will tend to help you in opposing the aeroplane's swing to the right. However, don't rely on this. As you gain speed, especially once the tail rises, the controls will become more effective and the inter-wind aileron can be progressively reduced. You may still need full inter-wind stick if caught out by a gust, so remain sharp until you're airborne. Don't try to raise the tail too early. The ground contact will help with the initial directional control and also reduce the chances of nosing over. Raise the tail smoothly to the flying attitude. It is important to establish the correct attitude to prevent a tail low lift-off at too low an airspeed. If the aeroplane is allowed to take off the tail low or too slow, be very wary of stalling, especially if conditions are gusty. and in a crosswind it's highly likely that the aeroplane will start to drift off the runway without the pilot having sufficient control to correct the situation. In these circumstances, all the pilot can do is to try to reduce the angle of attack, and hence the drag, very gently without letting the aircraft contact the ground. All the whilst hopefully avoiding the scenery ahead or alongside the aircraft. Raising the tail and letting the aeroplane accelerate to its correct flying speed in the level flight attitude, rather than pulling it off the ground prematurely, will obtain a shorter takeoff distance. Given the correct attitude, the aeroplane will fly itself, in the case of the Tiger, off at the ground at about 45 to 50 miles an hour. Then it can be held just above the ground and allowed to accelerate to 65 miles an hour, which is its climb speed. If there is a crosswind, consider holding the aircraft gently on its main wheels until reaching the takeoff speed of around 55. At this speed, following a positive liftoff, the aeroplane will not touch the ground again. Remember to apply drift once airborne to avoid being blown from the centreline, and always keep the wings level with ailerons. Once climbing array, check your airspeed and oil pressure, and always keep in the back of your mind, or indeed the front of your mind, where you're going to go if the engine stops at any stage of the takeoff. So here we are coming back to Lyon-Solent, and we're going to have a look at some landings. Basically we fly the air approach just as we would with a nose wheel aeroplane, maybe in a slightly continuously curved approach to keep a good view of things, but we're going to land just to the left of the main runway on the grass. We bring the aircraft down into the flare, and instead of letting the wheels touch on, try and hold the aircraft about a foot off the ground, gradually easing the stick back, raising the nose and increasing the angle of attack until we stall on. There's the nose rising, the flare commencing as the aeroplane levels of the ground, and as the speed reduces, the pilot progressively eases the stick back and the aircraft drops on 3 points. This is a touch and go, so pull smoothly, opening the throttle, keeping the aircraft straight with the rudder, wings level with the aileron, and adopting the takeoff attitude. Again, once takeoff speed is achieved, the aircraft lifts from the ground and climbs away. So from the outside, you can see the aircraft coming down and flaring, being held just off the ground, and it decelerates very quickly into the 3-point attitude. From inside the cockpit, the throttle is closed, the stick gradually eased back in the flare, and then progressively brought back into the full 3-point attitude, and once on the ground, the stick is held firmly back, keeping the aeroplane straight with the rudder. Let's see it again from the outside. Flaring, holding the aircraft off, and on it goes in the 3-point attitude. And again, throttle closed, flaring the aeroplane to level, progressively bring the stick back to raise the nose, and once on the ground the stick comes fully back, keeping the aircraft straight with the rudder. Here are the Dutch landing the aircraft with a slight crosswind from the right hand side. You'll see the aircraft flaring and a little bit of right hand aileron being applied. It's in fact a slight wheeler, and a wheeler technique is a very good landing technique if there's a significant crosswind. The aircraft isn't held off, it's just flared and the main wheel's allowed to touch. As the main wheels touch, the stick is gently eased forward very slightly to stop the tail from descending, and that way the landing is broken into 2 separate movements and gives more time and thought to keep the aircraft straight. Here we're watching a different Tiger land. We're looking aft, and I want you to watch the rudder to get an idea of the amount of movement that's required to keep the aircraft straight. It's actually a wheeler landing, but as the wheels touch down and the speed reduces, more frequent and greater displacement of the rudder is required to keep the aeroplane straight. The easiest way to see if the aircraft is yawing is to be looking down the side of the fuselage forwards and see if the horizon in the distance is traversing left or right on the nose. Here you can see a tiger moth that's going to side slip as it starts its approach. He's using cross controls of rudder and aileron. This technique increases the aircraft's rate and angle of descent, as it obviously doesn't have any flaps. All good landings start with a good approach, so it's really important to fly the correct approach speed. The recommended speed for a glide approach is 65 miles an hour. and in light winds that can be reduced by 5 miles an hour to 60. One major difference with the Tiger to other light aircraft that confuses some people converting is the feel of the elevator springs. The elevator trim operates 2 springs, and particularly during the hold off you can end up feeling some load on the control column, which sometimes modern pilots mistake for aerodynamic load, when actually they're just pulling back against the spring. So remember, the most important bit is the attitude of the aircraft. Now we're going to send Paul back up into the circuit and have a look at a couple of poor landings. Basically there are likely to be 2 errors, either flaring too early or too late. On this landing he's flared it on, but the aircraft still at flying speed hits a bump and it bounces. To recover it he applies nearly 2/3 power and holds the attitude, and the aircraft sinks gently back on. Let's have a look at that again. It was on the ground, you get the same effect if you bounced it. Here he goes. Puts the power up, throttle goes at least halfway forward, hold the attitude, and the aeroplane cushions back on again. If he wasn't happy, then of course he must overshoot and go around again. This time he's flared it too high. As the aircraft's attitude increases, he needs to apply the power, again up to about half throttle, hold the attitude, and the aircraft will gently descend back on in the 3-point position. So there he is. Nose high, speed would go low if he hadn't opened the throttle, so it's imperative that he opens the throttle about halfway forward while holding the attitude to cushion the aircraft back on into its 3-point landing. A good landing starts from a good approach flown at the correct speed. Here's Mike Vasey landing a Gypsy Moth on a strip. I want you to watch the angle between the horizon and the nose as he flares to the 3-point attitude. Up goes the nose and the aircraft lands on. And then he's got to rudder like mad to keep the aeroplane straight. Remember, don't relax until the aircraft comes to a full stop.